On December 4th, 1872, the crew of a ship called the Dei Gratia spotted something strange in the Atlantic. At first, it was just a vessel in the distance, moving awkwardly near the Azores. But the longer they watched, the more wrong it looked. The sails were set badly. The ship drifted and wandered instead of holding a proper course. It wasn't sinking, it wasn't smashed apart, but it also wasn't being handled by anyone. That was the first unnerving part. The second was the name painted on the hull, Mary Celeste. Captain David Morehouse of the Dei Gratia knew that ship. He also knew the man commanding it, Captain Benjamin Briggs. So when Morehouse sent men over to board the vessel, this wasn't some random salvage job. He was looking at a ship captained by someone he personally knew well enough to understand that if Mary Celeste was drifting alone out there, something had gone very wrong. The boarding party climbed aboard and found no one, no captain, no crew, no passengers. Benjamin Briggs was gone. His wife Sarah was gone. Their 2-year-old daughter Sophia was gone. 7 crewmen were gone. But the ship was still there. And that is what turned this from a maritime loss into one of the most famous mysteries in history. Because Mary Celeste did not look like a ship that had been destroyed. It looked like a ship people had stepped away from. There was cargo in the hold. There were supplies on board. Food and water were still there in quantities that should have lasted for quite a long time. Personal belongings had been left behind. The vessel had some wear, some damage, and water in the bilge, but not the kind of damage that clearly explained why every person on board would abandon it in the middle of the Atlantic. The ship's lifeboat, though, was gone. So now the question becomes the same one people have been asking for more than a century and a half. Why would an experienced captain take his family and crew off a ship that was still afloat and still capable of making it to port? To understand how unsettling that was, you have to back up to the start of the voyage. Mary Celeste left New York Harbor on November 7th, 1872. She was a brigantine, a real working merchant ship, not some cursed vessel with a bad reputation attached to it. Her destination was Genoa, Italy, and her cargo was industrial alcohol packed in barrels. Captain Benjamin Briggs was 40 years old and widely described as capable, steady, and careful. He was not known for recklessness. This matters because a lot of theories about the case depend on the idea that he panicked or made a wild decision, but Briggs did not have the reputation of a man who frightened easily. Traveling with him were his wife Sarah and their young daughter Sophia. Their son had been left behind with family so he could continue school. The crew had also been selected with care. By the known accounts, there was no obvious sign of serious conflict on board before they sailed. So this was not a ship limping out to sea with chaos already brewing. It was a routine commercial voyage. Then, somewhere out in the Atlantic, routine ended. When the Mary Celeste was discovered on December 4th, her last log entry was already several days old. That entry placed the ship near Santa Maria in the Azores. So at some point after that final known note, the people aboard vanished, and the ship kept going without them. That gap in time is where the whole mystery lives. And the more people looked at the facts, the less simple the story became. One of the first suspicions fell on the men who found the ship. That wasn't random paranoia. Under salvage law, bringing an abandoned vessel into port could mean money. So people naturally wondered whether the crew of the Dei Gratia had something to do with the disappearances and then turned the whole thing into a profitable rescue. On paper, that suspicion had a motive, but the physical evidence didn't give it much support. There was no convincing proof of a violent fight on the Mary Celeste, no clear signs of a massacre, no obvious bloodshed that solved the mystery in one stroke. And if the Dei Gratia crew had killed everyone aboard, that raises another problem. What did they do with all those bodies out in open water while still leaving the abandoned ship behind as a nearly intact crime scene? That theory grabbed attention, but it never settled the case. So the search for answers moved in other directions. Piracy was one possibility people talked about early on, but piracy usually comes with a clear purpose. If raiders seize a ship, you expect stolen valuables, missing cargo, or obvious destruction. Mary Celeste still had her cargo. A lot of the ship's stores were still on board. That didn't fit cleanly. But again, The known facts make that hard to walk into place. Briggs had a solid reputation, and his wife and little daughter were on board. Even if the crew had turned on him, why abandon a seaworthy ship afterward? Why leave in a small boat instead of keeping the larger vessel? Then there were the more dramatic explanations. Sea monsters, waterspouts, a giant wave, a seaquake. Over time, the Mary Celeste became the kind of story that attracted speculation almost automatically. Once a case moves into legend, rumor begins to stick to it. New details appear in retellings. Some grow larger every time the story is told, and that happened here. Later versions of the mystery would sometimes make the ship sound like a frozen, haunted scene, with meals left on the table and violence hanging in the air. But one of the hard parts of this case is separating the evidence from the mythology that grew around it. The basic facts are mysterious enough without extra decoration. A real ship crossed the Atlantic. A real captain brought his wife and child aboard. A real crew sailed with him. Then every one of them disappeared, and the vessel itself did not disappear with them. That is the part people keep coming back to. Because if Mary Celeste had gone down in a storm, this would be tragic but familiar. If pirates had burned her or stripped her, the case would be brutal but straightforward. Instead, the ship survived. The people didn't. Which brings us to the explanation that many people consider the most believable. Remember the cargo, industrial alcohol in barrels. Years later, attention focused on the fact that some barrels were found empty or leaking. That opened up a theory that feels much more grounded than monsters or mutiny. If alcohol fumes built up in the hold, Captain Briggs may have feared an explosion. You can picture how that might have happened. A captain checks below and finds the smell too strong to ignore. Maybe something about the cargo worries him. Maybe he hears a noise that sounds like pressure or a small internal blast. Maybe he thinks the next spark could ignite fumes and turn the ship into an inferno. If that was his thinking, then leaving the ship for a short time could have felt like the safer option. Not forever, not as a surrender, just long enough to get everyone clear while the danger passed. That theory also lines up with another important detail. The disappearance may not have been blind panic. Some navigation instruments were missing, along with the chronometer. That suggests the people leaving the ship may have expected to survive. They may have believed this was a controlled evacuation, not a last desperate leap. And if that is true, then the picture becomes even more haunting. Benjamin Briggs, by most accounts a cautious and experienced captain, may have made a deliberate decision that made sense in that exact moment. Get everyone off, take the boat, stay close, wait it out, then return. If that was the plan, something broke it almost immediately. Maybe the lifeboat was secured to the ship by a line, and that line failed. Maybe the weather shifted faster than anyone expected. Maybe the ship, light enough and still under enough sail, began pulling away before the people in the boat could stop it. That kind of disaster doesn't need violence to become fatal. It only needs distance. At sea, distance can open up with terrifying speed. A ship that seems close enough to reach can become unreachable in moments. The people in the lifeboat might have believed at first that they could get back alongside. A few shouted instructions, a pull on a rope, a quick correction, another wave, and then the gap grows. The larger ship drifts farther. The people who just stepped away from safety are now watching it leave without them. If that is what happened, then the final minutes of the Mary Celeste story were not supernatural at all. They were human. A captain trying to protect his family. Crewmen following what may have sounded like a reasonable order. A temporary decision becoming permanent. Still, even that explanation doesn't answer everything cleanly. Why leave a vessel that, while imperfectly handled, could still float and eventually be brought into port? Why did the condition of the ship not show a single obvious emergency that forces the whole case shut? Why does the timeline still leave room for doubt? The theory explains a lot, but not every last corner of the mystery, and that is probably why the Mary Celeste has lasted for so long in the public imagination. It sits in that narrow space where an explanation exists, but certainty does not. There are mysteries that stay alive because nobody has any idea what happened. This one is different. With Mary Celeste, people can almost see the answer. They can imagine the captain weighing risk against risk. They can imagine Sarah Briggs holding Sophia in the cold Atlantic air while the adults focus on the ship. They can imagine the crew believing they were only leaving for a short time. But imagination is not proof, and the ocean did not leave behind a witness. By the time the abandoned ship was taken into Gibraltar, news of the case had already started spreading. Newspapers seized on it. Rumors multiplied. Writers and storytellers kept returning to it. In later years, even fiction helped blur the line between the documented case and the more theatrical ghost ship version people like to repeat. That blending of fact and legend is part of why the story still feels bigger than a single maritime incident. But strip away the embellishment, and what remains is still chilling. A respected captain set out across the Atlantic with his wife, his little daughter, and 7 crewmen. Their ship was found drifting. The cargo was still there, the vessel was deserted, the lifeboat was gone, and no one ever came back to explain why. More than 150 years have passed since then. No final witness surfaced. No confession arrived later to clear the whole thing up. The missing people were never restored to the story in any complete way. The Atlantic kept them. Maybe that is why this case lands so hard, even now. Not only because people vanished, but because the ship remained. It kept floating as if the voyage itself had outlived the humans who were supposed to guide it. A found ship is often supposed to answer questions. In this case, it created them. And maybe the darkest possibility is also the simplest one. Maybe there was no grand conspiracy, no pirate attack, no mutiny, no monster rising from the sea. Maybe there was just one decision, made by an experienced man under pressure, in a moment when he believed he was choosing the safer path. And then the ocean took that choice and turned it into a disappearance. That's the Mary Celeste mystery, not a story about a haunted ship. A story about a ship found alive enough to keep moving, and a group of people who stepped away from it for reasons we can partly understand and can never fully prove. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. The answer might not be impossible, it might be ordinary, just hidden forever in a few missing minutes on the open Atlantic. As always, visit us at readtherealstory.com for more unbelievable true stories. Until next time, stay curious.